Hey guys, it's Dean. Welcome back to the Better Man podcast. Today's episode features Andrew Daniel. He is an award-winning and international best-selling author and director at the Center for Cinesomatic Development. His book, Awaken to Your True Self, is a Gold Nautilus Book Awards recipient and the #1 Amazon bestseller in the US and the UK. Andrew had a very successful career starting at age 18, creating a particle and physics engine used by top former 100 companies over 7 years in the software business. And then he came out with a book in 2014 called Holistic Sex with Mind Valley Publishers. And this provided the world with a new paradigm that bridged the divide between sexuality, spirituality, and the sexes. He is also an advisor for the Alan Watts organization. So Andrew has a lot of background in the self-development world. We're actually also going to get into some of his what he found wrong with the self-development world. And that's what I really want to focus on. One big thing I want to focus on in this conversation. So Andrew, thanks for joining me for today's episode.
Thanks for having me, Dean.
Good to be here. Exactly. So I usually like to start these talking about, how did we get to know one another? So I got an email from Andrew telling me about his work, and I looked at the book. I was like, this is really cool. This is a really great concept. So I read the book. I'll be honest, I didn't read all of the book. It's a long book. I read a lot of the book though, and I skimmed most of it. And what I really like about this is it is a non-traditional kind of book in the self-development category. And what I really like about your story is that, you say, hey, self-development was helpful in a lot of reasons, but there's also a lot of reasons why it didn't go deep enough. So I'm interested in getting into this a little bit more. So, wow, I'm just monologuing here. I swear I'm going to ask you a question and get you involved here. I do want to say, so in the past, I've done these interviews and we have, we talk about your personal story, right? Your personal struggle with ultimately what you created, because that's what most people have, right? They create solutions for their problems and they share them with the world. And so, the problem that I've had in this podcast episodes in the past is that there's too much to fit into one episode. So what we're doing now is we're going to talk about your personal story in this first episode, and then we'll do a follow-up episode and we'll get a little bit deeper into the kind of the solution that you've created. So
excellent.
Yes. So hopefully those of you listening thinking like, Dean, your podcasts are way too long, this is the solution, hopefully. So hopefully it's not too long. So yeah, let's get into it. I'm not sure how to start this. So your book, Awaken to Your True Self, Your True Self.
Awaken to Your True Self.
Yes. Awaken to Your True Self. Starts off with talking about kind of your experience with self-development. And you mention there's a lot of good things that you've improved as a result of your personal work and self-development. But you also led into, things that were missing. So I'm wondering if you could start off, let's just talk about, what does the self-help category get wrong, or what didn't work for you?
Yeah, this is something that's very close to me because I've been doing this since about 2004. I've been learning about this stuff. And first few books I read, Think and Grow Rich, How to Win Friends, Influence People, these sort of classics.
The OGs.
Yeah. And they were great. They opened my mind to the possibility that there was something I could do to change my life. I grew up, I was bullied and teased. I had warts on my fingers when I was young. So I faced a lot of social ostracization, rejection, being made fun of. And there was a lot of stuff that happened that put me into what I call the victim mentality, right? This victimhood mindset where everything happens to me and I just have to react to it. Well, what the self-help stuff did was the biggest thing was to show me that there was something I could do about it, that
Mhm.
I didn't have to be the effect to life. I could be the cause to my life. And that itself was huge because it said, oh my God, I'm not just stuck with the hand I was dealt. The cards
Mhm.
that were dealt to me weren't, well, put it this way, my perception of those cards and what I could do with them wasn't as limited as I thought. And so,
Mhm.
what the personal development, self improvement, self help stuff did was show me that I had hope, that I could do something, something was within my own power to change my life.
Mhm.
So, that's what put me on this entire journey of healing, of development, even entrepreneurship.
Mhm.
So, as I was going through this, as I said, there's a lot of great stuff here, but there's a few booby traps. There's a few things that I found from my own experience and what I saw out in the industry. I don't know, fall short or be these booby traps or create limitations. So, one of these would be um, let's just start with the industry as a whole. The industry as a whole, how I see it, is most stuff that is being put out isn't very good, um, especially with the advent of self publishing.
Mhm.
There's a lot of stuff out there that just is the same stuff, just repackaged, regurgitated. There's
Yeah.
not too much original ideas, original content.
Mhm.
And if you look at all of the people at the top, all of the big names, they all know each other. They're all in each other's masterminds. It's kind of like this good old boys club. And,
Mm.
uh, I wasn't and I'm still not a part of it. And that's fine. But if you look at these New York Times bestsellers, these are the cream of the crop of the best-selling books, self-help books.
Mhm.
And only maybe 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 are actually really like profound. They're things that
Mhm.
have lasting staying power that people
Right.
could read decade after decade after decade, even centuries later, and still be helpful. And so that was one of the things I saw is that after you learn a certain amount, you just keep coming across the same ideas, just repackaged in a different way. And sometimes that can be helpful because you need another voice. Maybe hearing it from
Mhm.
another place finally helps it sink in. But it was a real problem in the sense that it's that saying, you can't invent something new, right? It's the same thing.
Mhm.
So that was a big issue from an advanced student of self help, is that you kind of just reach the point where you're not
Yeah.
really finding anything new. So
Yeah, when
then
you
what?
read, like, the old books, like, if you read, like, the original self-help books, like, if you go way back, like, we're talking, like, ancient Roman times, and you read some of those translations, and then you read a new book, you're like, "This is just paraphrasing this book that was written 2,000 years ago."
And not
So
even
I
as
can.
good.
Right, and definitely
Yeah.
not as good. This is dumbed down, or it's explained in, like, a different category. It's like I've took it out of this context and I put it into another
Yeah. Right.
context, or I built upon something that somebody else did, which is building upon this other book that somebody wrote 2,000 years ago. So there if you really master the not even master, but if you gain enough familiarity with the core concepts that you find in other, self-help categories, you recognize them throughout every one that you read, and you're like, this is nothing new. This is all
Yeah.
just the same. It's just presented in a different context.
Yeah. And so the problem with that I found is that what happens if you're still stuck after all of that?
Hmm.
What happens if after reading all that stuff, like I did, and doing a lot of self help, healing, transformational, spirituality, all of this stuff, holistic, cleansing, all of these things, what happens after learning all of this? You're still stuck. What then? And then, so this leads me to the next thing is that most of the self help work out there is information. Now, don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
Information is power. Knowledge is power. But it really only does anything if you apply it, if you
Right.
know how to take action. And so the even deeper missing piece was what I call embodiment. Everything was based on the mind. Everything was based on the head. It was knowledge based. So of course it's based on the head. And so changing your beliefs, changing your mindset, very important, incredibly powerful, much more powerful than just simply adopting a new behavior without making any change.
Mhm.
So, really great stuff. But I found it fell short because I had acquired all of that knowledge. I knew all of this stuff up here. But for some reason, even after being published, even after having a software company, I was homeless twice. And so I was like, what is going on here? I've learned these things. I've even learned the secrets. I studied old esoteric, principles of like, okay, well,
Mhm.
what's the secret? What's the real stuff, that's hidden from society?
Yeah.
And I learned those things and they were great, but I still wasn't getting the results.
Yeah.
And so actually having practical, applicable use of this stuff that's embodied was one of the biggest missing pieces. That, oh, the body actually has a connection to these emotions, to these belief systems, to the mindset, and there's something in here that makes the difference. You can see somebody showing up in a space that's all in their head, that knows all the intellectual ideas,
Mhm.
but they don't do anything with it. You're like, wait a minute, if you know all this stuff, how come you're not the one on TV? How come you didn't write the book? How come you don't have the
Mhm.
girl? Whatever that is.
Mhm.
And so that was one of the biggest missing pieces that ended up helping me break through.
That's a big topic that I talk about on this podcast a lot, actually, is there's a difference between knowing something logically and being able to. I used a different term, or like kind of a different description for what you're talking about. You mentioned like being able to not just know it in your mind, but also being able to kind of intuit it in your body, in your practices. And for me, I kind of describe it as um, I talk about it as there's a difference between knowing something and then really internalizing something and getting it beyond having to consciously thinking about it versus subconsciously acting upon that knowledge. Like there's a difference between me reading something and saying, "Oh yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that's a good thought that's a good like way to look at things." And then looking at something, or like looking at something happening in my life, and then by, and then subconsciously thinking about it with that new belief that made sense, right? So there's a um difference between knowing something logically and actually practicing it, having internalized it and like making it part of how you behave. So that
Yeah,
makes a lot of sense to me.
yeah, that's like the. Have you heard of the unconscious incompetence, conscious competence, uh, unconscious uh, incompetence, and conscious unconscious competence kind of thing?
There's like
Where
a flow through like
yeah, there's four of them where you don't
okay.
know that you don't know, and then you know that you
Mhm.
don't know, and then now you know that you know, and you're good at that, and then you just do it. It's unconscious.
Yeah.
Um, and that's kind of like that mastery level. It's where it
Mhm.
goes from just you have no idea, then you know that you don't know. Well, then you are practicing it with your mind, and then it's unconsciously integrated, like you said, and you're doing it.
Yeah. So what are the practices that take you from having this knowledge and actually, taking it into now this is something that I act with this knowledge now. I
Right.
know that I know and I do.
Yeah.
So um yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's a good place to get into it. So I came up with a few things based on your book that I think would be good to go into, and things that, I think most people don't get, but I do want to come back to that. We talk about like what are the practices to internalize, or what's the term that you use to
Embody.
embody? Ooh, that sounds a
Yeah.
lot sexier than internalize.
Well, it's different too. So
Hmm.
the unconscious competence that you're talking about is great, but that's still different than embodiment. When I say
Hmm.
embodiment, so a lot of people use embody as what you just said, right? This just
Mhm.
unconscious competence. You live it, right? You embody these principles and you live them in your life.
Mhm.
Great. Well, what I discovered that blew my mind, that made the difference between everything else, was that I realized that embodiment actually involved the body.
Mhm.
So the stories, the mindsets actually show up in the physical way that you move your body.
Mm.
And using the body as sort of a truth telling device, of a litmus test, uh, of a revelatory way to know if we are actually doing this, has been the biggest game changer. Because it's not like, are you embodying the principles of courage and kindness and generosity? I don't know. Yeah, I think I am. Well, in this work, we can actually verify that. We actually look
Mhm.
at the results in your life, and we actually look how you show up in the body. And from there, we can feel and see if you are actually living these principles or not, because it does show up in the way you move in your body.
Hmm. So I want to ask, how did you start practicing that, or how did you move into incorporating the body movement into that process? But I also want to say, as somebody who, um, as someone who's very, as me, I'm very kind of logical minded. Like I kind of, it's tough for me to, I don't know. It's tough for me to make decisions with my gut, or kind of just, and it's
Mhm.
something that I've been practicing really strongly for the last couple of years, and that I'm very conscious of. Even I think within the last few months, I've been much more conscious about, like, what do you feel is the right answer? Like, don't think about it, just like, what is the answer? So like with my, I've got a 3-month old right now, and my wife will ask me, do you think she's hungry? And instead of like thinking about, like, well, is she hungry? Let me think about it. I'm just like, what is my gut response? Because I've been living
Yeah.
with this baby for 3 months. Like, I've been here. I go to work a couple of times a week, but I've mostly been here. So instead of like thinking about, well, let's see, she's been in 45 minutes. We got her. I'm just like, is she hungry? Like, what do I think? Like, I
Yeah.
think she's hungry. And instead of like questioning, like, well, why do I think she's hungry? I'm like, no, because I think she's hungry. Like, I'm just, so I'm learning more about how do I get past thinking about something, and just like, well, what do you feel, you know? And even
Exactly.
another thing I've been doing is, at the end of my day, I uh I ask myself, like, and this is something that was is an assignment given me by my my cognitive behavioral therapist. But it's, what's something that went good today, what's something that went bad today, and how do you feel? And like, I think if you ask me how do I feel before, I sit there, I'm like, huh, well, let me think about how I feel, which is bizarre, right? Because you don't think about how you feel. You just
Exactly.
feel.
Yes.
But I have
Yeah.
to be, like, for me, I have to practice it. And that's
Yeah.
something else in your book, is like, you have a whole section, you have a whole chapter on your book about getting out of your head and into your feelings.
Yeah.
Which is just like it's so interesting to me that that's even a thing, because
Yeah.
that brings up so many different thoughts, like that, you know as a society, we focus more on our logic than we do on, like, our emotions. um but yeah, that just took me off on a tangent. But you were going to talk about, I was going to ask you about, how did you start thinking about, the self development world, in terms of
Well,
starting to look at your body
yeah.
embodiment, instead of just like, let's learn some things and let's implement them.
Yeah. Well, what you just said, that's the exact same thing. So I'm actually going to tie in everything you just said with that question. Really wasn't a tangent at all, because I was very similar. I was in my head. I was a programmer, all right? So I
Mm,
was bullied and teased, and so I retreated up into my head where it was safe, right? I was not athletic, and there was the
mm,
jocks who tended to make fun of me, pick me last in gym class, mocked me. And so in retaliation, in defense, in survival mode, I was like, okay, well, mind over matter, mind over might. And
mhm,
it's better to be smart than strong. I started to rationalize how I could not have to be in the pain of being in my body. of
Mhm.
what athleticism and sports and all of that stuff meant to me. And so I got into computers, and then I created a software program, and a huge portion of my life I spent up in my head. And not only up in my head, but in fantasy in my head and
Mhm.
thinking through everything and playing scenarios out, playing all these scenarios out of being rejected by women, of having revenge, or, what my life was going to look like later on. And I could say, screw all you guys, all of this hurtful response to this trauma, to this pain. And so
Mhm.
this is what I talk about in that chapter that you mentioned in my book. And this is the egoic intellectual's pain. And this is a lot of times what happens, especially to men, is that something happens emotionally. There's some feeling that we don't want to ever feel again.
Mhm.
Huge rejection, an abandonment from a parent, divorce, something big like this happens, or maybe a culmination of smaller things. And we say, fuck this. I'm never going to feel this again. And so we cut off the feeling and we say, I'm going to be in my head. And then we start living our life from logic and reason, because we say, logic and reason makes so much more sense than being emotionally reactive, right? We'll see maybe our sisters or our mom or women on reality TV being hysterical. And we
Mhm.
say, feelings, right? There's a quote, I think it's Ben Shapiro. He said, facts don't care about your feelings. And it's this mindset of saying, okay, well, emotions and feelings are just this overly feminine, reactive, useless thing. Logic and reason has provided us with the electricity and the internet and computers and machines and power and all of this stuff. And it's a very logical response. However, almost
Mhm.
always I've seen it come from a response to pain, of not wanting to feel. And so what
Yeah.
happens is, as a culture, we've gotten out of relationship with actual feeling, with real emotion. And
Mhm.
so I want to make a distinction here between feelings and feeling. So feelings that we talk about in everyday parlance is usually hysteria, it's reactions to feelings, it's acting out the feelings, it's pretty much all of the drama and noise around not feeling something that we don't want to feel, crying
Mhm.
hysterically, our opinions about stuff. Oh, you hurt my feelings. All of these things, in comparison to logic and reason, are inferior. That stuff is drama. That is chaos. That is noise. It really doesn't help. It is inferior to looking at the facts and coming up with a real conclusion. Now, the difference between that and feeling is everything. Feeling is actually feeling. It's looking down, it's going into your body rather than thinking, rather than suppressing, rather than checking out, rather than dissociating. It's having the courage to go inside and actually feel the stuff that is uncomfortable, that hurts, that's painful, or even joyous and loving, maybe overwhelmingly too much beauty and love and
Mhm.
compassion. And
Well, that's the thing
so,
about feelings, you don't get to choose. If you shut
yeah,
out some if you shut out one spectrum of feelings, you shut out all the spectrums of feelings. So,
exactly.
like, we subconsciously make the decision to avoid pain by becoming more logical. So instead of like looking at something that happened to us, you know, instead of looking at something that happened, we and saying, oh, that hurt. We look at it and say, well, logically, blah blah blah. Logically, this is
Right.
actually good for
Yeah.
me because, and we
Sure.
we we ignore that feeling. But when we avoid hurt, when we avoid pain, we also shut ourselves off to like feeling joy.
Pleasure.
And yeah, and you know it's it's interesting that we logically we do all these things so that we can be happy, but you don't experience happiness when you
Yes.
shut yourself off to emotion. So it's like, well, yeah, like, well, what are you doing this for? Like, if you can't experience emotion.
Exactly. And so this you bring up a great point. That leads to what's called suffering. And suffering isn't the pain. Suffering isn't the hurt. That's inevitable, right? You're going to get hurt. You're going to feel pain. Stuff's going to suck. Stuff's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to get rejected. There's going to be this stuff that happens, but it doesn't mean you have to suffer. But when you numb yourself off, just like if you take an anesthesia, something like this. If
Mhm.
you numb out part of your body, you don't feel the pain, but you can't feel anything. You can't feel the pleasure. So when
Mhm.
we numb out, suppress, avoid all of this stuff, it's exactly what you said. Well, if you're unwilling and unable to feel the pain, you're not going to be able to feel the pleasure.
Mhm.
And so that that in the long term creates a lot of suffering, because you can end up being some man who numbs himself out, is dissociated, and you're in a marriage, you have a family with children, you're providing, you're tough, you're doing everything that you should be doing logically, but your
Mhm.
wife, your children have no access to you. And I get this from clients all the time. Men come in, and as little boys, women, I have women, both men and women actually come in and say, my father, yeah, he showed up, as in he didn't abandon the family. He was still there
Mhm.
providing, but he wasn't there. He
Mhm.
he, he didn't show up. He wasn't
Yeah.
fully there and present, and it really affects children. So this is something that we think is going to help us be happy, but
Mhm.
it really doesn't.
Yeah. The irony of that situation is that I think men are being tough. Like they're being tough. They're being like like they're being more masculine. They're being braver, or they're being like more, tougher by not by not experiencing the emotion, or like by
Well,
but whatever it is. But in reality, like, it takes a lot of courage to be able to experience. It takes far more
exactly.
courage
Yes.
to be able to experience that vulnerability, to be able to go to a place where you be able to walk into an emotional space where you're like, this is going to hurt, like, this is going to hurt me. But instead, you shy away from it. You're like, I don't want to go there because I know it's going to be uncomfortable. And so
Yeah.
when you start to look at it like that, and you start to realize, like, I want to be like you know, I want to be a courageous man, or like I want to be a brave guy. And then you look at, like, oh, I'm shying away from being emotional because it might hurt a little bit. Then you're like, oh
Yeah.
wow. Now you have a totally different perspective on what it means to be vulnerable and to be emotional. And it's actually, I think it's a much more, it's a much harder to do. It's harder to do, but it's more rewarding. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the irony. It's like, wait a minute. You think you're being so tough and strong, but you're actually cowering away from the pain. You're not wanting to feel rejection, or even in the other extreme, there's pleasure, right? There's a lot of us who feel like we don't deserve love, and to have a
Mhm,
woman in our life love us unconditionally, oh no, no. And then we reject it, we push it away, and then they get
mhm,
hurt and we're hurt, and it's just because we don't feel like we deserve it.
mhm,
And so that takes a tremendous amount of courage to go into that feeling, into that shadow, and be there and open up to love. It's
mhm.
much, much easier to run away and close off to love
Yeah. So,
in the short term.
yes, in the short term, right? This is like and that's another theme in the book, is like you're putting off. I remember reading there's a section on, you know, victiming, being victimizing
Yeah.
yourself, which I think is a really fascinating concept, because there are so many ways that we victimize ourselves without realizing it. Like, there's, everyone, go talk with somebody and they're going to say, like, well, I wouldn't want a victim, I wouldn't want to play the victim. And then you actually look at their lives. You're like,
Yeah.
let's do a deep dive on what you did today. And you realize all the things that they did to provide comfort to themselves in the moment, to absolve themselves of responsibility, instead of taking some sort of responsibility or the ability to do something about it, which is this victimization.
Weeks.
That's what it is. So like we don't even realize like how many ways we're practicing making ourselves the victim. Um, but I want to do I we 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 talked about some great stuff, but I want to get back to like what made you start to practice like looking at how you move your body, or like what is the physical aspect to all of this, and how did you start looking into that?
Yeah, so I was homeless for the second time, and this was again after have being published, after my course was up around
Just goes to show
sexuality.
you that authors don't make a lot of money on the books alone, unless they're really good. Unless you're J.K. Rowling. Um, yeah.
Yeah, it's not the book. Yeah, you learn that real quick. It's not the books alone, unless you have a lot of books that are selling a lot of copies. Even for this book, I've sold a lot, but that came from spending ads. So all the money that was coming in, I was being spent to sell the books. Um, so yeah, it's it's a very very different world than it was decades ago.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I was published, and 3 months later, I was homeless, and I was like, "What the hell just happened?" I thought I made it, right? I thought I had it
Yeah.
made. My name's up there next to all these other teachers that I just was studying for 10 years. I was like, "This is amazing." And yeah, 3 months later, I was homeless, and then I had my software company about a decade before that. So I knew that I was competent. I knew that I was smart. I knew that I could achieve stuff. I wasn't lazy. um, or any of this stuff. And so it was very disorienting, very confusing. And then I was introduced to the work of my late mentor, who started pioneering combining video with movement. And then working with him is when I started to see, oh my God, the image I have of myself in my mind does not match what I'm seeing in my own body on the screen in front of me. And so
Mhm.
that was the moment of, whoa, in my mind, I think I'm this wonderful, great, kind, friendly, confident guy. And I saw myself on video and I said, oh my God, this is narcissistic. This is manipulative. This is passive aggressive. There's all this shame. I'm hiding out. I'm playing small. I'm playing dumb. Oh my God, no wonder my life hasn't been working. This is the reality of what's happening. And so seeing that what was showing up in my body was the thing that was actually getting me the real results in my life, and how different that was than the image I had up in my head,
Mhm.
that was the turning point in my entire journey. I said, oh, this is the missing piece in all of the self help work is, oh, this is the embodiment. It doesn't matter what you think up in your head, it matters how you're showing up in your body. And then from there, um, I spent about 3 to 5 years daily doing this embodiment work. And since then, I founded, after he passed about 4 years ago. I took everything I learned from him. I took everything I've also learned on those other 10 years, and I kind of brought it all together, took it further with cinema equipment, and then created Cinesomatics. And through that journey of those 5 years of everything I learned, that took me from 8 years of self help work
Mhm.
that helped but didn't quite break me through. And
Mhm.
then those 5 years of, after all of that, what actually did break me through, I wrote this book. So everything in this book were the things that for myself and my clients helped break through even after I had done all of the work. Because I'm like, I've
Mhm.
done all of the work. I've done everything. I've done the plant medicines. I've done the traditional therapy. I've done holistic stuff. I've done all of these things.
Mhm.
And I still couldn't break through. And so I wrote this book for people and myself of the actual things that did break me through when all of that stuff else failed.
So you talk about, you did these 3 to 5 years of this embodiment work on a daily basis. Like, what does some of that actually look like?
Yeah, great question. So One of the things that that I learned was that the body actually contains masculine and feminine within it. So there's a yin and yang
Mhm.
polarity actually within the body.
Cool.
And
This
so,
is this is the concept that I've explored a lot recently on this podcast. So
oh, great, excellent.
let's yes. So I love this. I'm glad that you mentioned the yin and the yang too, because one of the things I just did recently was questioning like masculine is masculine is and this is another topic, but like is masculine versus feminine even like the right is that even the right like term for it? Because I think yin and
Yeah,
yang makes much more sense because you hear masculine, you're like, well, I want to do what the masculine does. Like, well,
right,
you
sure.
also have feminine. Well, if I do less of the feminine, if I do less masculine, then I'm less of a man and I'm less worthy. And you're like, well, no, that's not quite how it works. So like, I like
Exactly.
that. I like the yin and yang terminology. That makes a lot more sense to me.
Yeah, well, and this is actually part of the healing is because I could use yin and yang and it means exactly the same thing,
Hmm.
but I purposefully still stick to masculine and feminine because it does trigger people, because there's all of that stuff in there. So remember, my
Hmm.
approach is as a healer, as a facilitator, which is different than maybe just a teacher out on the street teaching kind of the masses kind of stuff.
Hmm.
So I am looking for the things that do trigger, that do
Yeah.
expose and reveal all of the parts of us that need healing, that we're out of
Hmm.
relationship with. And so someone would come in and do exactly that. And I say, okay, well, this shows you're out of relationship. You have a distorted idea of what the
Hmm.
feminine is because it's not what
Yes.
you think. It is just yin. But because you think feminine is inferior and all of these stuff, that's what we need to look at. That's what we need to start
Yeah.
healing so you can gain access to all those resources that you've rejected because of those
Yeah.
judgments.
That's we had a relationship guy on the podcast recently, Emilio Palafox, Palafox pronunciation. But yeah, one of the main things he says is like triggers are gifts because you figure out like, oh, that's something to dig into. Like let's figure
Yeah.
out why this is a trigger for you.
Yeah. It points to what needs healing.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I love it. It's like, oh, well, that means something needs to be healed. Because why am I taking it personally? What meaning am I giving it?
Hmm.
It's, you know, what is that about? And so our society, especially right now, is just gone ape shit, crazy, insane around anything. Like you can't even say man or woman without people going nuts now.
Right.
So there's a lot of healing and clarification that needs to be done because a lot of people are having these reactions because of distorted definitions of these things.
Hmm.
And then starting that healing work individually helps the process as a culture.
Yeah. All right, so I took you off topic once again. Guys, if you've listened to these shows before, you know I just go wherever wherever I want to take it. So, let's get back to you're talking about examining feminine versus masculine, yin versus yang in the embodiment
Yeah.
practices.
Yeah. So, well, everything we just talked about is stuff that I had to address. So daily in my practices, one of the basic things we do is just shaking our hands. And so when you
Okay.
start shaking your hands, you start to
Like
see, yeah,
we do this video too. So, if
yeah,
you're listening to this wondering like what's going on, I'm shaking my hands like just like this.
yeah. I would back up and shake it however you feel would be natural for you. Yeah. So what we would see here is that your right side is going to be your masculine, your yang, and your left side is your feminine, your yin. And as you shake your hands and the way you shake your hands, where you shake your hands, how you do it, reveals all of these subconscious patterns. It reveals how and what your relationship is to these polarities. And then from that, it's, doing the work of going into it and healing that and becoming aware of, oh, yeah, my masculine is dominating my feminine. Oh my God, this is my parents' relationship. And you see that a lot. You actually see the parents' relationship manifest in the way the child shakes their hands because our mother and father are two primary figures of modeling the masculine and the feminine.
Hmm. So can you see? So if you look at my hands, is there something that you can do you have the lens? Does it work like via webcam, or like do I
Oh
have to be
yeah,
in
yeah,
person for you to? All right,
yeah. If you,
let's do
all right,
this.
yeah, let's do it. So this is your natural. You got to move. If you can move the mic, please. Thanks. So this is just how you naturally would feel to do it.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the first thing that I would see is that symbolically and mythologically, you're in the underworld, right? So you're down in the lowest part of where you could be in your range. And so there would be stuff here to explore because I would be, um, it is, it's not what I would expect, seeing as how popular and visible you are out on the internet.
Hmm.
Someone that would be more visible would actually have their hands higher to be more visible. Now, maybe there's something there where, all right, this is vulnerable,
Hmm.
or maybe there's another thing running, let's say, of wanting to be relaxed. So maybe it's a way to kind of discharge any anxiety. Um, I also saw that there was a fairly, you were fairly relaxed, but there was still control in the hands. So yeah, so I didn't see too much because it was so low and slow in the
Hmm.
masculine and feminine. So if you want to, yeah, raise them up and shake them here. Yeah, so you can see that you're much more active in the masculine on the right side. The feminine looks a lot more shut down and passive.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
So
So go ahead.
you go ahead because I have a question about that later because I'm an athlete. Like, so I grew up playing sports. I grew up working out, and as an athlete in most sports, you're gonna use one hand as dominant. So
Yes.
like when I played baseball, I played football, I played lacrosse, I played soccer. I kicked with my right foot, which means that my left leg is dominant because I plant with my left foot and then I swing with my right leg. So that's the leg that I kick with the most. As a lacrosse player, you're ambidextrous, but you have one side is stronger than the other. So I
Mhm.
throw with my right, which means that I'm going to twist. I have a stronger twist to my left. It's harder for me to twist to my right. So the point of me saying all these things, these examples, is that as an athlete, hearing that your left side is your feminine side and your right side is your dominant side, to me, I'm like, no, my left side is the side that I shoot with less, and my right side is the side. So like
Uh-huh.
I haven't developed like a normal, or I've developed unnatural movement patterns because of a sport that I played. So
Yes.
like, so when I hear that's your feminine side, that's your masculine side, I'm
Uh-huh.
like, no, that's the side that I shoot with. That's the side that I
Sure.
don't
Yeah.
shoot with.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it kind of like, to me, it's kind of like I have like a skewed, like I have a skewed
Yeah.
movement practice because of, or like a skewed whatever that would be because of my background,
Yeah.
and how I move my body.
Yeah. So now here's the interesting thing. And we don't necessarily know exactly just in this 1 minute.
Hmm.
Um, but let's say you were a client, we worked together for a while.
Hmm.
Well, the question is chicken or the egg, right? Is your body skewed because of the sport? Or did you show up in the sport that way because that was your natural inclination and relationship with those
Hmm.
sides and those energies?
Hmm.
And also, the flip side is that, okay, let's say you've been dominant that way your whole life. Well, that matches what you said about being mostly logical in your head, because that's
Hmm.
all of the masculine. When you line up the hemispheres, they're contralateral, and so the
Hmm.
left controls the right, right controls the left, etc.
Hmm.
So what what would be a really helpful thing for you is to start reversing that. So
Hmm.
instead of doing everything with your right hand, start doing everything from the left hand, but not just doing it unconsciously, doing it from the qualities of the feminine, right?
Hmm.
So the feminine is going to be uh, feeling, intuitive, creative, surrendering, nonlinear, non-rational. It's going to be receptive. It's going to be an in energy, not a penetrating energy. So there's all of these qualities that the feminine is going to take while approaching problems or life. So you go
Mhm.
into your business, you go to plan a video. Maybe your normal way is this masculine, linear, logical way to do it. Well, then try doing it through the yin way. All right, well, what if we do this non-linearly? What if I do it from feeling? Instead of thinking about it, what if I feel through it? And then doing that and also using this part of the body and actually tuning into, all right, well, this feels a lot more shut down. What happens if I bring it up? What if I turn this online, start using it? Well, maybe all of a sudden there's these judgments, right? Maybe you're judging yourself even athletically. Well, this isn't as strong. Well, I feel weak. I don't want to feel weak, right? Okay, great. Judgment, block, story that comes
Mm.
up. All right. Maybe it feels more vulnerable. Great. Right. So these are all things that we would normally avoid not wanting to feel. But in this work, we want to go into it to develop relationship with it so it doesn't run our life.
Mhm. Hmm. Okay. All right. So hand thing. So you learned this from, and this came from your late mentor. This is where you started learning
Yeah.
to integrate the body stuff into it.
Yeah. And so
What did
that's,
you
yeah.
notice? What did you notice when you started to practice this?
Oh gosh, my hands were completely doing different things. So that's
Mhm.
another thing that we see. So when you shake your hands, are they shaking in unison, right? Do your hands, are they connected to each other or are they doing different things? Are they just completely in different rooms? And we see this. We see parents' relationships, even people's dynamics. I had a client call uh, an assessment just a week ago, and and I said, okay, well, it feels like your masculine is doing this and your feminine's doing this, and they're like, they just started laughing. I was like, what? They're like, that's my parents. That's my parents' relationship.
Mm.
And so what I saw was that my hands were hysterical and they were yelling at each other. It was like this bickering, right? Like if you see it on video, it's like this one's bickering. But people do this. They just shake their hands like this. They have no idea. It's all subconscious stuff. And then you see it, you say, "Oh my God." And so this is how the person is relating to men and women, the masculine, feminine within themselves and in the world. And so what I started to do is say, oh my gosh, okay, well, this is dysfunctional. And then starting to, not through my head, not through forcing it, but through the feeling. All right. So I go into the chaos, I go into the bickering, I go into the fighting. And then immediately there's all this pain, there's all this sadness and longing to have had a functional relationship, to have had my parents love each other and in peace rather than fighting all the time. And then so by discovering this stuff through my body movements, I started the emotional trauma healing that
Mm.
then started to in turn change the way that I moved in my body. And so that was a daily practice. That was just one element of one diagnostic. We do other things with archetypes in the body, how archetypes show up around making everything, making money, giving, receiving, all sorts of stuff. And so it's all done through the body, not through the head.
Hmm. What were some other manifestations of you being in your head versus being in your body?
Fantasy. So that was a big one. I was living in a fantasy world. I remember when I was homeless going around trying to practice law of attraction stuff and being like, affirmations, I'm abundant, I'm abundant, I'm abundant. I literally had pennies in my bank account and I was delusional. It wasn't just affirming myself being positive, I was literally denying reality so I didn't have to face it. So I was up
Mm.
in a fantasy because the reality was very grim. And so I realized I was living in this parallel world. And it's what I said earlier is that I had an image of myself in my head that did not match my body. And so being in a fantasy, being in my head, prevented me from actually achieving all of the things I wanted to in my life. So that was a big thing of the difference between actually choosing something, right? I eventually chose to be an author. And the only way I really knew I choose that is once the book was published and it was in people's hands.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it could have been I was choosing to be an almost author or a writer that didn't finish a book. So, real choices and the real results you get in reality are reality. That's how you really are, not the image, not the fantasy that we have in our head. So
Mhm.
that was a big one.
Yeah. So in your book, you talk about, people aren't going to recognize this immediately if you think about what narcissism is, but you talk about narcissism in the sense that narcissism is not just looking in the mirror and loving yourself. It's looking in the mirror and loving the image of yourself
Yes.
that you think is there. And there's it's not a quick jump from looking at what you think narcissism is and then looking at this manifestation of narcissism. So it might be helpful to read the book and read that chapter in particular to get to that point. But this is, in a way, this is kind of, I'm going to kind of segue this to, this is related to this concept of the stories that we tell ourselves. So I wanted to bring that up because I don't think people realize that most of what goes on in our head isn't reality. It's the interpretations of reality. It's the stories that we tell ourselves. And so I'm curious for you, like, what are some of the other stories that you told yourself, and things that, once you started to look at them and really unpack them, that you started to make some significant improvements in terms of, you know being okay with who you were, your true self.
Yeah, so let's start off with what a story is, because that's really, really foundational to this conversation. So, a story is basically everything that we tell ourselves around the truth, around the facts, around the actual thing,
Mhm.
right? So, let's give an example. So, a story would be Bob is such a jerk. He never shows up on time, and he really uh, is kind of a really judgmental person that I don't like being around, and I feel icky. And he has this weird thing on his face that just really bothers me. And every time we hang out, he's bringing me down. He's got bad vibes, and um, I just can't stand to be around him and nothing ever works, right? So this is just like a narrative.
Bob sucks.
Yeah, damn Bob. And so this is a story, right? It's just all of these things around it. Another one is like what happened to me. Oh yeah, so Bob did this to me and I was just being so nice and he just had to come in and treat me so poorly and I can't ever do anything right. I can't ever make him happy and it's just never enough and if he would only do this, right? So that's a story. So you can see in the story there's judgments, there's drama, there's this narrative. Well, the truth is like, what's actually happened? Bob did not show up on time. He disrespected me, and he has a thing on his face. Okay, whatever. Right?
Mhm.
Those are the facts. Those are just the details. All the rest of that stuff was drama. Okay, well, in the other example, um, just Bob disrespected me, and when I show up to help him, he does not acknowledge or appreciate it. Okay, right? So those are just the details. You're just reporting the details. What the actual feeling is, the actual experience is. All the rest is story and drama. And so we whip up all of these stories that we tell ourselves. And these stories bind us to an unreal past because it's not true. Especially as time goes on, those details tend to get muddied up. They tend to
Mhm.
blend into a bigger narrative and a story. And we have themes of these stories, right? The poor me story, the martyr story. I also call these myths, right? Because
Mhm.
these are overarching stories that affect through our whole life. Chances are, if you have a story that people don't treat you well, that probably happens more than once in your life, right? Because you've created a story that you're such a great person, but nobody treats you well. Um, you probably have that because it's happened multiple times in your life. And so these stories bind us to the past because until you stop telling those stories, well, obviously, you keep repeating the stories and then you
Mhm.
keep getting those same results over and over again. So you're carrying these past experiences that you've distorted with all of this
Mhm.
noise and are recreating it now in your life.
So these stories that we tell ourselves, we tell them to ourselves because in a way they help us because they they give us more control over the situation. We feel like we have more control over the situation because we recognize the pattern. We're like, this is what's going on. Even if the end result is not what we might want to experience, at least we know what's going to happen and it's predictable. So we feel like more
Mhm.
controlled in that situation. Um, so
Yeah, it's a certain
that,
amount of false safety,
hmm
um, a certain false control where a lot of us would rather know we're going to be rejected and not do anything that will get that rejection and stay
hmm
comfortable than have to face the chance that
hmm
we might be rejected, the uncertainty. Um, and it's not even just the negative stuff, it's positive stuff. We can have stories around things that, oh, everybody loves us, we're just great. Well, maybe, maybe not.
hmm
And so we can spin up all of these stories, and really, what happens is they keep us away from our truth. They take us further away from reality. And so this is what I said earlier: is that I was living in a fantasy. I was living in
hmm
these fantasies. I was telling myself all of these stories, and they just weren't true. They just were not true, and they kept me in tremendous suffering.
So did this was the big like if you could, obviously it doesn't happen all at once, but was the big oh great, oh crap, I'm living a fantasy or like okay, this isn't working out, like I'm not who I thought I was or like what was your your oh shit moment? Was it when you that 3 month point after you found yourself homeless?
Well, I had two. One, the first one was when I was 21, and I told you at the very beginning about going from being at the effect of my life to the
hmm
cause. That was my oh shit moment of, oh my God, I've spent my entire life being a victim. I've spent
hmm
my entire life acting like I have no power. I've been giving my power away to these bullies, to my
hmm
parents, to all of these things.
hmm
So that was probably the biggest and most important one. And then the second one is also what I said earlier of when I finally saw myself on video and saw, oh my gosh, I actually saw it in my own body that what I thought about myself in my head did not match what I was seeing on video.
hmm
And that
That's
undeniable proof was like very confronting.
what did you I'm trying to better understand that. So you looked at yourself and you just the person that you saw like the it wasn't who you thought you were or you there was just like such a disconnect between like
Yeah,
it was
so
like what was that?
so the practical how that would look. So in this work in cinesomatics, what we do is we have people move, right? So let's break down cinesomatics. So cine comes from video. It
Mhm.
also comes from the Greek kino of a movement, and then somatics of the body. So basically, what we do is in cinesomatics, we have people move in their body. We can get them on a slack line, rollerblade, dancing, shaking their hands, doing archetypes through the body, tossing balls, all sorts of stuff.
Mhm.
And then we film it. Then we play that video back, and I am giving feedback again through feeling. It's not body
Mhm.
language, it's not a heady analysis. I'm feeling those subconscious dynamics underneath their movements in their body. And then as I'm giving them that feedback, they're seeing it for themselves on video.
Hmm.
So that's cinesomatics. So that's the process that I was undergoing. And so
Mhm.
what happened was I was moving. Let's say I was doing a dance
Okay.
or I was just walking around the space, literally can just walk around the room. How you do one thing is how you do everything.
Mhm.
As above, so below. How you move in your body, how I show up onto a call, how I do anything is how I'm going to do everything else in my life. And so by seeing the way that I moved in my body, I saw that's how I was showing up in my business, in my relationships, in my life. So
Mhm.
for example, walking around the room, if I'm disconnected from the space, so I'd see myself and I looked alone and isolated, energetically, symbolically, I didn't see that it felt like there was people around me or
Mhm.
that I felt safe in the room. So I started to see how isolated I was from my environment by the way that I moved. I saw how I wasn't connecting with the space around me. I also saw how I saw things as threats. I saw how through my movement, I was inviting attack, and then I would use that attack to beat myself up with. I could see as I walked around all of the judgments I had of myself in the space. I saw as I moved around how I was making it all about me.
Hmm.
And so that helped me start seeing this narcissistic piece where I wasn't really caring about other people. I was kind of caring about other people in order to get my own needs met. And so,
Mhm.
okay, well, then there's a subtle manipulation here. So all of these things started to come through simply by the way that I moved and interacted with the space around me.
Hmm. Okay. And so was it your mentor who was able to help you kind of point
Yes.
things
Yeah.
out? Okay, so that was how you learned those things. And then he kind of he said, "Hey, this is what I'm seeing." And you said, "Oh, that makes sense." And then you were able to is that kind of what
Yeah.
happened?
Yes. Yes. So one of the
Okay.
really important pieces here is getting that external feedback. So there's a
Yeah.
chapter in the book called The Essential External. And when we're stuck in our head,
Uh-huh.
uh, and we're isolated, it's really hard to see our blind spots. We're
Mhm.
blind to it, right? So
Yeah.
we have these filters. I call it the perceptual stack. And so we have distortions, deletions, judgments, traumas, all of this stuff in between what really happens and our vision, right? So here's what's actually happening in the world, and here's what I'm perceiving. Well,
Mhm.
there's all of these layers of filters in between what actually happens and what we see. That's why when you have five people all at the same event, they're going to say five different things happened because
Mhm.
they're not seeing reality. They're seeing a filtered, distorted reality. And so
Mhm.
having a facilitator, having somebody that has collapsed um, many and most of those filters in order to actually see the reality, to see these subconscious, unconscious patterns that are showing up is really important. And then you have the video to confirm it. So you don't just walk in and you have a guru or a teacher or some authority that you have to blindly trust to say, you're being narcissistic. You're like, screw you, dude. What are you talking about?
Mhm.
And then he says, well, look at the video. Can you see the X, Y, and Z? Like, oh, yeah. Oh my God, I don't, this is really uncomfortable.
Hmm.
Right. And so having that facilitation is really important because there, I don't know another way to get through this stuff without some sort of feedback, whether it's through looking at yourself. You
Mhm.
can get to a certain point where in my book, I have an exercise where people can film themselves and they can see stuff, but they're only going to be able to see to a certain point because their own filters and stories are filtering and distorting what they're seeing. So
Mhm.
getting either another person who's like myself, who has done the work to be able to see that stuff clearly, or having a group of people that through just the amount of numbers and reflections, you
Mhm.
can kind of triangulate on the truth, right? Because if five people say, yeah, this is what I see, and one person says something different, well, when you have five people it's probably that one person that may be distorted, and then they can have those reference points through that external feedback.
Hmm.
So having it on video to see this stuff in your own body for yourself, plus getting feedback on what is actually underneath it, uh, was one of the most important things. And which comes
So that,
back to the self-help narcissism, because you
mhm,
can't do this stuff yourself. I tried
yeah.
for a decade to try to figure it out myself because I made it mean something about me, right? If I needed help, that meant I was weak, that I couldn't do it myself.
Hmm.
And so it's just layer after layer of all of these stories and meanings that I had to collapse in order to finally let the truth in.
Yeah. So in terms of what were some other things that you did in terms of recognizing those stories that you told yourself, in addition to some of the embodiment practices that you talked about? What else was really helpful for you?
Stopping,
Hmm.
stopping. So I have a whole chapter in the book called
So
Just Stop.
just kind of being aware.
No, well, awareness is very important. Actually, having that self awareness is really the first step,
Hmm.
um, because if you're not aware, you can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
So every strategy I have in the book starts with awareness. You have to become aware of this stuff,
Hmm.
and it requires um, courage. It requires a dedication. You
Hmm.
have to be committed to this. And so, one of the very last things I say in the book is make truth the most important thing. Make truth the most important thing. Otherwise, if you make comfort more important than the truth, if you make feeling happy more important than the truth, if you make all of these things, anything else, more important than the truth, you're not going to be able to break through, because it's going to be very easy to not be willing to do whatever it takes to get to reality, to the truth.
Hmm.
And um, reality is really important.
Hmm.
It's the place to get to. When you live in a fantasy, you're in suffering. When you're telling these stories, and you're having all these distortions, you're removed from reality. And so, imagine your life. I had this experience where I felt like I was just watching a movie go by. My life just felt like I was just dissociated, watching Andrew just go through life. Literally remember moments where I had to go and find a building and just touch marble and concrete. I'm like, where am I? Like, really getting into my body. That's how dissociated and checked out I was.
Hmm.
So having that awareness, having that willingness and dedication to say, okay, well, this sucks. Am I willing to do whatever it takes to find out the truth about why I'm stuck, why I'm
Hmm.
suffering, about who I am actually showing up in the world as? Yes, because I hit rock bottom multiple times. My life depended on it. So I said yes. And from that dedication, I would be in the middle of conversations and I'd notice myself starting to lie or tell a story. And I would
Hmm.
stop. I would literally, in the middle of words, say, no, I just lied. That's not true. This is really what it is.
Hmm.
And so I started a stopping practice as well with it. Every time I started to go into a story, every time I started to lie to myself or others, every time I started to abandon myself, betray
Hmm.
myself, I would just stop. Every time I would feel the addiction to go in, yeah, but, see, well, I knew it. Every time I'd abdicate my responsibility to be a victim, I would stop.
Hmm.
And so it was a constant process of stopping, stopping, stopping,
Hmm.
stopping. Because what I discovered, this brings us full circle back to the self help work. And the problem with it is that most of it's about adding. Most of it's saying,
Hmm.
oh, you're not enough. Just kind of like the advertising and beauty industry, towards, well, men and women, right? You're not enough. Here, buy this makeup, buy this bra,
Hmm.
uh, do this workout, right? Eat this kind of protein shake and you'll have the muscles. All of this stuff
Hmm.
is designed to say, you are not enough as you are. Here's the solution. Add this, right? It's always add this because that's buying, right? That makes the whole consumerism cycle work.
Mhm.
And so this was an inherent, I found, flaw in the self-help work for advanced students. Now, when you're starting out, when you're a beginner, you might not know anything. You might be really young. You might not have experience. You might not have developed yourself.
Mhm.
And you might be hopeless and lost, like I was. And so having the hope that you could add to yourself, that you could become something more than you've seen yourself your whole life, that's very empowering. It's uh, very beautiful. However, eventually you get to the point in that journey, in the transformational journey, where adding more doesn't add more to your
Hmm.
life. And so it becomes a practice of stopping and subtraction. My work is subtractive because, Dean, one of the things that we find out, that even if you make it, even if after a decade you get the business, you get the girl, you get the life,
Or the
you've
guy.
proven yourself.
Sorry, I had to put that in there.
What'd you say?
I had to say, or the guy. I
Oh
just
yeah,
had
or
to.
the guy. Yeah.
Forgot to mention that
Who-
the last time you said it. Just wanted to be inclusive. Go ahead.
yes, everybody. Whoever you get, whatever you want, the money, the fame, attention, whatever, right? Everything, the love, as you fix yourself, improve yourself, add more to your life, even if you improve, what happens is you get further and further away from your true self. Because
Mhm.
even if you prove yourself and say, you know what, I was enough, I could do it, I am lovable, I am great, look all of the value I can provide to the world, it still validates the lie. It still validates the lie that we were broken to begin with, that we
Mhm.
were unworthy to begin with, that we weren't inherently already enough, that we
Mhm.
didn't already have what we need. So this is one of the most insidious things, is that even if you get there and improve, if you're coming from the core belief that you're not enough, that you're unworthy, that you're unlovable, um, you're gonna you're gonna be further away from your truth. And what happens is people start getting imposter syndrome, or they start
Mhm.
feeling like a fraud, or they'll self sabotage, because still underneath all of that, there's that lie. And so if that partner, that money, that success is taken away from them, well, guess what? It then validates again the lie that they weren't enough, that they were unlovable, et cetera, et
Mhm.
cetera, et cetera. And so the only way through this is through subtraction. It's through subtracting all of the things that are not who we really are. And
Mhm.
it's to getting back to that truth that we are enough, that we have everything we need, that we are lovable, there's nothing wrong with us.
Mhm.
And if you go on the journey of growth and healing from that place, everything you're going to do is going to be sustainable. Everything you're going
Mhm.
to be doing is based in reality. So it's not about not learning or growing or healing anymore. It's the place we're coming from while doing it, and
Yeah.
the process that we go about achieving it.
So it's the difference between I'm doing all this self improvement because if I didn't do this, if I didn't achieve these things, then I wouldn't be worthy. But it's going back to I don't need all of these things to prove the narrative that I'm worthy. I'm worthy without all of these things. And that's
Exactly.
yeah. So like that was reading your book, there was one really big light bulb moment, which is the we only have problems when we create problems. And this is, I was thinking about this in the context of what had been going on that day with me. And it was I think I had looked out at my backyard and I was like, "Oh, I need to do this. Oh, like I need to make this addition to the backyard." And I'm like, "Oh, great. Now I've created this new problem for myself. Like I've 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 added unnecessary stress to my life because I have looked at something that I think should be improved. I have put in my head that I need to get this done, or I'm going to be worrying about it um, if I don't get it done. And if I had just not created the problem in the first place, there would be no stress around it. So we create problems. The problems only create when we exist them, and then getting to the bigger theme of that, being your true self, is, we come up with these ideas of how we need to fix ourselves. But if we were to give up the expectations of what we think we should be and just accept who we are, then we wouldn't have those problems of self-worth to begin with.
Yeah, it's the quest for the solution keeps the problem alive,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So
So
you saw the backyard and you're like, "Oh, look at this solution." Well, that created the problem.
yeah, right.
And if you said, "Well, I don't need to add this thing in," well, then there's no problem. And so
Yeah.
practically in our own life, right? It's like the more you look, how do I become lovable? I need to find the solution to become lovable or to be enough, right? Oh, well, it comes back to what I said earlier. You're adding more. You're finding the solution, which creates the problem. It's a math equation,
Hmm.
right? It's literally a math equation, right? You have um, you have a plus one, and you're equaling zero, which is peace. And what do you have to do to get zero when you have a plus one? A negative one, right? So
Hmm.
just having that equation creates the necessity of that problem. And so if you stop having to fix yourself, and
Hmm.
again, this isn't just mental gymnastics, you actually have to embody this stuff. You actually have to be at peace. Well, then the problem just goes away.
Hmm.
And so we spend our life in this self-help work, the right, reading books, taking more courses.
Hmm.
Eh, well, guess what? It keeps implying that there's something wrong if
Yeah.
you're doing it from this perspective, if you're
Hmm.
looking to fix. Now, you could just grow, right? You could just read because you love reading. That's wonderful. But if you're reading because you need to solve a problem, well, guess what? It keeps the problem alive. But what if you just
Hmm.
stopped? Would you have the problem anymore?
Hmm.
It's like um, I don't know, these imagine having like a militia, and it's training all of the time to fight, and it's just doing it, for years and years and years and years.
Hmm.
Man, you're going to get antsy, that they're going to want a problem so they can
Yeah.
use their solution.
Hmm. Yeah. I like how, you have a whole chapter on get out of fixing mode. Um, and
Yeah,
if,
stop fixing and start living.
yes, which I think was something, yeah, I like that concept, without, just stating the obvious, or just, you
Yep.
know, just agreeing with you and nodding my head and saying, oh, yes, yes, I agree with this. Yes, the concept is great. And, um, getting out of fixing mode and into a moving out of, and I think a general sense of what we've talked about today is it's getting out of this reactive mode and getting more into a proactive or a creative, sense of thinking. So we're not looking at problems to solve. We're we're not looking at problems to solve. We're not looking at, um, here's the problem and I'm going to fix it. But instead, do you see what I'm trying to get at? Like
Yeah,
trying to get out.
it's having a vision, right?
Hmm.
So we can spend our whole life trying to fix ourselves so we
Hmm.
can be enough. Well, or you could just be enough and create the life that you want.
Yeah. So like
Um,
going after like what's exciting. I
yeah.
mean, so I think about it in terms of like, I was able to like think about this in terms of like manful yoga, for example. So I was thinking, okay, like, well, social media, got to fix our social media. I don't like that part of our social media. Like, oh, I'm not really happy with this email series that we have for new members right now. I got to fix this. And then, but getting out of that and getting into like, what would be really cool to create, or like,
Yeah.
what would make me excited? Or like, what would, what would really help, our customers? What would be something that like, hey, let me explore this possibility, and coming at it from this it's almost totally opposed ways of thinking. One of it's coming at it from this like this problem solving, if I don't fix this my business is going to fail, and then coming at it from like, my business is fine. How can I make it even better? Like, how can I make something like really cool? And
Well,
it feels different.
yeah. Well, it's also a great example of this yin and yang aspect, right? This yang is very linear. Let's solve the problem. Let's fix things, right? That's us as men, right? We like to fix the fuck out of everything, which is
Mhm.
great. It's great. But as you know, if all you have is a hammer, everything's going to look like nails.
Yeah.
And so more of this yin quality is going to be more of this creative, right?
Mhm.
Literally just from rational to creative, and it's going to feel different. You're not
Mhm.
thinking about it in a different way. It feels different. So you literally just did just such a perfect example of a yin versus yang approach to the same thing.
Mhm.
And it's not like one's better or worse than the other. But you could look at your life and say, well, what is going to lead me to the life that I want? There's
Mhm.
times where there's times where you need to fix something, like if it's actually broken. And there's other times where it's actually nothing to fix, nothing's broken. You're just looking at it that way. Well, then look at it through this lens. Oh, yeah. Well, what could I create? What feels really good to move here? And so
Mhm.
it's knowing when and where and how to use either approach. When does black work? When does white work? When does yang work? When does yin work? When does a
Mhm.
masculine approach work? When does a feminine approach work? And then ultimately, what we do in the body is, as I said earlier, this comes back to the handshaking, is how do we get the hands doing the same thing? How do we get their range to be the same? How do we get them to be on the same page? How can we get them to dialogue with each other? And so when you embody this, you're actually embodying all those resources that we just talked about in a practical situation. And you can go, oh, look, oh, and then you just do it. Like as you said
Mhm.
earlier, you act from that unconscious competent place and you do what needs to be done from the most fruitful energy, from the most
Mhm.
fruitful approach.
So that gets me to the last question I want to ask before we go into the quick part two section. But we talk about being able to be in your body, being able to be aware of these movements. So, have you noticed a correlation between overall alignment to true self and people who are practice movement and are in their bodies more frequent than people who are not? So, like if I exercise regularly, if I'm a dancer, or if I have a yoga practice, or if I, you know, I think I think we can draw. There's I'm thinking different. I think that a dancer, for example, would have much better embodiment practice than a weightlifter. But I don't know. That's just my assumption. Have you noticed anything in your work that can we say some sort of correlations about that?
Yeah, well, one of the things is that we do find that athletes or anybody that does a physical movement practice is generally going to have greater physical intelligence.
Hmm.
So they're going to generally um, have much more physical range, besides obvious stuff, right? So like a gymnast is going to have a much more flexibility and range than, let's say, a heavy weightlifter, stuff like this.
Hmm.
Um, what I what's less of a correlation is more of not of a correlation is that I found more interesting is that it's not everybody. So what I find is that there's a lot of people that are doing fitness or dancing or all of this stuff, but they're all in their head. They're
Mm.
all in technique. They're all coming from ego. They're not in feeling. So you can move in your body great without feeling it, without having any of that feeling component. And you see that a lot. A lot of modern dancers are just doing technique. You
Hmm.
don't get moved by it. It's the difference, Dean. It's the difference. I don't know if you've ever watched ice dancing, figure skating,
Hmm.
um, but there's a difference between the skaters that they do it perfect. It's beautiful. Wow, they have great
Hmm.
form. And you're like, oh, that was great. Versus the ones where you're like, You cry watching them. They literally move you, right?
Mm,
It's why it's called being moved. Something moves us.
mhm,
That difference I've discovered, and this is when I work with people in Hollywood, Olympic athletes, very high performers in the world. This is singers, musicians here in Nashville. This is really the secret X factor that everybody wants to know what it is. What's that thing that just makes the difference? It's feeling.
mm,
That's the multi-million dollar secret. And I'll tell you right here, it's feeling. It's actually being in the feeling, connected to the body, emotionally, energetically, the whole system's online, rather than coming from ego, technique, your head, strategy, all of that stuff. As your mind, your ego, kind of informing and telling your body what to do, rather than your body, letting your body move.
mhm,
Now, that is something that's becoming more and more rare, because as a culture, everybody's on their phones, everybody's in their heads,
mhm,
they're not in touch with their feeling, they're dissociated, there's all this trauma. People are less grounded. If you go back, here's a just a perfect illustration of this. Watch some modern, I don't know, musical or dance movie or something like this, made in the past few years. Then
mm,
go back and watch um, Frank Sinatra, right? Go back and watch um, Rita Hayworth. Go back to that generation of dancers, of movers, of uh, Hollywood actors. They feel completely different. You can watch those movies, they're all in joy, they're all having fun. They move much more in core down here in their body. They're not up in their head, they're not in their chest and ego. They're not performing, as in selling themselves out. Go on Instagram, it feels gross. It's a
mm,
completely different feeling. People are doing it for attention. They're in their ego. Um, they're not really having fun. They're putting on a mask. There's this fake smile.
mhm,
They're, you know, just it's a completely different energy. So this correlation I found, well, this like almost not correlation surprised me a lot, because I said, oh, well, this person's in their body. They're very flexible. They're very strong. They should do great. And you
mhm,
see them shut down. You see insecurities. You see shame. You see a lot of uh, self-judgments, criticisms, all of that stuff um, gets in the way between them and their true self.
mm,
However, with that being said, people that have a greater physical intelligence, who do the work and are willing and ready to commit to it, tend to move very, very fast, because that stuff's because it's built in. They have the muscle memory, they have those neural pathways. It's just the emotional components that have been blocking them.
hmm. Okay. Man, a lot more questions that I have. Good thing we're gonna have part two here, and we can talk more about practicing feeling, more about the stories we tell ourselves, more about what being your true self actually means. So that's going to be next episode. But part two here, this is my rapid fire section. Um, First question here. What do you think is one habit, belief, or mindset that has helped you the most in terms of your overall happiness?
Feeling. Instead
Feeling.
of thinking my way through the world, feeling my way. Yep.
Hmm. What's one thing you do for your health that you think is overlooked or undervalued by others?
That's a great question. Um, I would say a movement practice, but I would also say nutrition. Um,
Hmm.
I think real nutrition, actually giving your body um, everything it really needs. So health, just like really
Hmm.
caring about what real nutrition is, um,
Hmm.
because without your health, you got nothing. The richest people in the world, billions of dollars, um, if they don't have the nutrition, if they don't take care of what's going on inside their body, um, they'll give it all up to be healthy again.
Hmm. True. What's the most important activity you regularly do for your overall stress management?
It sounds kind of lame, but I like to take long hot showers.
Okay. That's
Just
a new
just
answer.
just
I love it.
yeah, just relaxing, just taking a break, no screens,
Hmm.
away from everything, and just stopping, just having that moment of
Hmm.
peace,
Yeah. I like that
relaxation.
you brought up the stopping thing, by the way. I didn't reply to it, but I like that you brought that up. It's something that I've realized doing in conversations when I realize I'm just saying something because I'm trying to like keep the conversation going. And I'm like, why am I saying this? Like,
Yeah,
I don't really feel like this.
yeah,
So, anyways,
that's great.
back to it. What's the most stressful part of your day to day life?
Well, something I'm very blessed to have. I have a lot of people wanting to work with me, and so I have uh, a very, very busy schedule. I have stuff to do. So, right now, the most stressful part of my life is trying to get all of the things I need to get done.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I hear that. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing men and their well being right now?
culture. This culture that is vilifying men and
Hmm.
does not care about young men, men in general, that have
Hmm.
thrown men to the wayside and um, vilified them for just wanting to exist and be men and masculine
Hmm.
and love. So, yeah, I think this Western culture that has vilified men um, as a whole is the biggest threat.
Hmm.
It's incredibly toxic and
Yeah,
destructive to the entire society.
yeah. I did a solo podcast and I talked about masculinity in general, but kind of the backlash against certain aspects of poor manifestations of masculinity,
Sure,
but
the
how
shadow. Yep.
that has transcended or built into this movement against anything that's associated
Yeah.
with masculinity. That's the problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
No. No.
it's tough to talk about. Like
Yeah.
I got people like mad at me because I talked about like, you made a podcast about masculinity. You said that, you know,
Yeah.
you want to be more masculine than feminine. I'm like, yeah, I do. Like that's how I feel,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
but
And,
like
and making you
it's
wrong for it. Yeah. It's and what you said is really important. Is that no doubt there has been men that have had shadow masculine aspects that are incredibly destructive, right?
mhm,
Just how men in the West has had a war against the feminine for centuries and millennia is terrible. It's awful. You know what we do to the environment, what we do have done to women, even femininity in general.
mhm,
There's incredibly awful things. Well, women aren't innocent either. There's incredibly toxic and shadow feminine aspects from women as well that has happened. However, because men have generally, assumed the throne, so to speak,
mhm,
it really has that top-down effect, which should change. That stuff is terrible. The billions of people that have died and suffered because of some of these destructive, shadowy aspects of men and
mhm,
masculinity needs to be addressed. And it's a few people, it's a percentage out of all men, and it's a percentage of all masculinity. Um,
mhm,
People seem to quickly forget that it's also masculinity that has created society and culture and civilization and protected and provided and have done all of these beautiful, wonderful, amazing things.
mhm,
And so it's not an either or. It's a yes and.
mhm. Yeah, I think that's well said, and it's like I'm glad that you have the courage to say that, because it's something that like I've also like realized like, wow, it's not easy for me to say this, and it's
Yes.
very, very unpopular to say like, I want to figure out how to practice like masculinity. And you see masculinity and you're like, even me, like I see masculinity and I get triggered as like, oh, it's gonna be like this is like toxic masculinity. They're all getting together and they're like figuring out how to be more toxically masculine to everybody.
Yeah.
And that's like, and that's just because like of, yeah, that's kind of the overall culture that we live in, is that it has made us suspicious of men getting together with only men, and also of masculinity in general. So yeah, it's I think that's a good answer, and it's something that hopefully uh, will be continued to bravely be discussed, and yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, until next time, guys, if you're interested in following Andrew, highly recommend his book. A lot of really thought provoking topics, just bolded statements, examples, things that you might be able to relate to your own life and point at and look at like, oh wow, that is something that I do. Um, Andrew, where's the best place to get the book and also to check up on you and
Yeah.
all you
So
do?
the book's Awaken to your true self, why you're still stuck and how to break through. Um, Everything's at andrewdaniel.org. I'm going to be starting up some YouTube stuff soon, but I'm mostly off social media.
Good
So
for you.
everything, yeah. Well, I was on social media for 12 years since the beginning when I was in software.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this is cool, and I was using it to suffer. I mean, I had
Yeah.
20,000 followers, and I'd post stuff that would take 2 hours to write, and I'd get 0 to 1 likes on
Yep.
it. I'm like, this is this is the biggest waste of my life. And so I deleted everything I got off of it. I have some stuff up just to be able to run ads or message people.
Yeah.
And in the time I would have spent suffering and talking to people that didn't care at all about what I said, I went and wrote this book. And then it won an award and became a bestseller. And it's changed tens of thousands of people's lives. I said, oh, that was a much more productive use of my time.
Yeah.
So everything's at andrewdaniel.org. My book, um, my if there's any slots available to do an assessment, there's stuff there. If you're interested in Cinesomatics, there's a link there to check out what that whole modality is about. And if you want to get in touch, there's a way to contact me.
Cool. All right, Andrew. Thanks, guys. Until next time, we'll be doing another one of these follow-up episodes, and I'm going to be asking more questions and digging a little deeper here. So, hope you enjoyed this episode of the Better Man podcast. And Andrew, thanks again for joining me.
Thanks, Dean. Appreciate it.
If you like that episode, check out this other one right here. I think you're really going to enjoy it. If you haven't subscribed, click this subscribe button over here, and you can listen to the full episodes on any major podcasting platform. Full details below in the description.